My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28 years old, and up until a few months ago, I lived what most people would probably call a very ordinary life. I worked as a preschool teacher at Little Sprouts Academy, spent my evenings grading coloring sheets or preparing craft projects, and came home to a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio. My paycheck barely covered the rent, groceries, and gas for my 10-year-old sedan, but I didn't complain. Teaching young children gave me a sense of purpose and joy that money couldn't buy. Every morning, when I walked into my classroom and heard little voices shout, "Miss Carter," with arms outstretched for hugs, I felt rich in a way my bank account could never reflect. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. But outside the classroom, life felt much emptier. My parents, Charles and Diane, were technically present throughout my childhood, but emotionally, they might as well have been strangers. My father buried himself in 60-hour work weeks, chasing promotion after promotion in the corporate world. He carried his success like a badge, but there was always a coldness in his eyes when he looked at me, like I was a project he never had time to finish. My mother, Diane, was no better. Her entire life revolved around climbing social ladders, hosting charity luncheons, and making sure she was photographed in the right dresses with the right people. To her, image meant everything. Love, comfort, and connection, the things a child truly needed, were always at the bottom of her priorities. I often felt invisible in my own home. Family dinners were rare, and when they did happen, my father spent most of the meal scrolling through emails while my mother rattled off gossip about her social circle. They provided for me, yes, I never went hungry, I wore nice enough clothes, and I had my own room. But when I think back on my childhood, what I remember most is the silence. The kind of silence that happens when people are physically there, but their hearts and minds are somewhere else. Thankfully, I had Helen and Robert Carter, my grandparents, my real family. From the time I was 5, I spent nearly every weekend and all my summers at their modest 2-story house just outside the city. Their home was filled with warmth, laughter, and the smell of my grandmother's homemade bread. Grandpa Robert would wake me up early to help him in the garden, where he taught me how to plant tomatoes and beans, explaining that patience and care always bore fruit in the end. Grandma Helen showed me how to sew buttons, bake pies, and, more importantly, how to listen with kindness. Unlike my parents, they looked at me like I mattered, like who I was, not what I accomplished was enough. Their values were simple but powerful. Hard work, humility, and generosity. They didn't flaunt their wealth, even though they had plenty of it from the family business they built decades earlier. To them, money was a tool, never the measure of a person's worth. That lesson stayed with me, shaping who I became as an adult. In their eyes, I wasn't just their granddaughter, I was someone worth investing time, love, and wisdom into. And that made all the difference. When I think about the people who truly shaped me, who taught me what it means to live with purpose and dignity, my mind goes straight to my grandparents, Helen and Robert Carter. They weren't just grandparents in the traditional sense, they were the anchors in my life. The steady force that kept me grounded when everything else felt unsteady. Their story, the way they lived, and the lessons they instilled in me became my compass, guiding me through choices I didn't even know I'd have to face one day. Helen and Robert were the kind of people you read about in American success stories but rarely meet in real life. They started from nothing, literally nothing. In the early 1972nd, my grandfather came back from serving in the Navy with little more than determination and a vision. He and my grandmother pooled what little savings they had, bought a single-use truck, and started delivering construction supplies around central Ohio. It was grueling work at first. Grandpa would wake up before dawn, load heavy materials by hand, and drive miles across the state to deliver to small contractors. Grandma handled the books, answered calls, and juggled a baby, my dad, Charles, on her hip while she managed invoices at the kitchen table. They told me stories of those early years, of how they sometimes skipped meals so they could keep fuel in the truck, or how Grandma reused the same envelopes by carefully steaming them open and resealing them with tape. Their lives back then weren't glamorous, but they were full of grit. Slowly, the business began to grow. Word spread that Mitchell Construction Supply, later rebranded as Carter Supply and Company, was reliable, fair-priced, and run by people whose handshake meant something. Contractors came back, then brought others with them. Within a decade, they had 3 trucks, then 10, then a small warehouse. By the time I was born in the mid-1000s, 992nd, Carter Supply had become a respected regional supplier, with dozens of employees, loyal clients, and a reputation built not on flashy marketing but on old-fashioned integrity. My grandparents never forgot where they started. Even when they could afford more, they kept their lives modest. Grandpa still drove his beat-up green Ford pickup, the same one he'd bought in the 82nd, with a cracked dashboard and a stubborn radio that only picked up one AM station. Grandma clipped coupons religiously, and every Sunday, she cooked meals that fed not just family but often neighbors, employees, and anyone else who happened to show up. Their dining table was never just for show, it was for community. Growing up, I absorbed their philosophy without even realizing it. My grandparents had a favorite saying, one they repeated so often it became a refrain in my head. Money is just a tool, Emily. Your worth is in your choices. At the time, I didn't fully understand it. To a child, money seemed like everything it bought: toys, clothes, vacations, all the things I sometimes envied when I saw my classmates brag about their trips to Disney or their new sneakers. But when I was with my grandparents, I noticed something different. Their joy came not from what they bought but from what they built. Relationships, memories, and a reputation for being dependable. Their values stood in stark contrast to the life I saw at my parents' house. My father, Charles, had grown up in the same home with the same parents, but it was as though he had lived an entirely different childhood. Where I saw love and wisdom, he saw deprivation. Where I felt security in simplicity, he felt embarrassment. My father hated that his parents drove old vehicles, that they shopped sales racks, that they refused to flaunt their wealth at the country club. He believed money was meant to display status, to elevate you above others. To him, the quiet life my grandparents chose was proof they were stingy or old-fashioned. The rift between them grew larger as the years went by. My grandparents paid for my father's education at Ohio State, something they had worked tirelessly to save for, but they expected him to work part-time jobs during the summer to cover his own expenses. They thought they were teaching him responsibility. He thought they were humiliating him. When he graduated, they helped with a down payment on a modest starter home, but he wanted a luxury condo downtown. When he asked for a senior position at Carter Supply straight out of school, my grandfather refused. "You'll start at the bottom, like everyone else," he said. My father didn't see that as fairness, he saw it as betrayal. By the time I was old enough to notice, my father barely spoke to my grandparents except to argue. He resented their refusal to hand him everything he believed he deserved. He left the family business altogether, choosing instead to chase corporate promotions in finance, and he wore his expensive suits like armor. He often mocked his parents behind their backs, calling them cheap and out of touch. My mother, Diane, fueled the fire, embarrassed to be associated with in-laws who still shopped at thrift stores even though they had millions in the bank. For me, though, my grandparents' world was a refuge. Summers at their house were magical. I learned how to knead dough in Grandma's kitchen, flour covering my hands as she told me stories about the early years of the business. I remember sitting on the porch swing with Grandpa, listening as he explained compound interest using my piggy bank as an example. He'd tell me, "Emily, people will always want you to measure yourself in dollars, but never forget you can't take a dollar bill with you when you leave this earth. What matters is the lives you touch." Oh, they lived what they preached. Carter Supply and Company wasn't just a business to them, it was a community. Employees stayed for decades. Not because the pay was always the highest, but because they were treated like family. My grandparents had a profit-sharing program long before it was trendy, and when employees' children went to college, they often found an anonymous scholarship check waiting for them, though everyone knew exactly where it came from. My father never understood why his parents gave so much away. "You're wasting what you built," he'd snap during rare visits. But my grandparents didn't see it that way. They believed wealth wasn't real unless it was used to build security and opportunity for others. They didn't want to raise their son to think he was entitled to it, they wanted him to earn his place. When he refused, when he walked away from the company, they let him. It broke their hearts, but they never compromised their values. For me, their way of living became the example I aspired to. They celebrated my decision to become a preschool teacher, even though my salary barely covered the basics. "You're building lives, Emily," Grandma told me once, pressing a kiss to my forehead after one of my student art shows. "That's worth more than any stock portfolio." And she meant it. Looking back, I realized that their legacy wasn't just about the millions they had quietly amassed or the business they had built from nothing. It was about the lessons embedded in every moment. Patience, humility, generosity, and the understanding that true wealth was measured in character, not possessions. But there was always a shadow over those lessons: my father's resentment. I could feel it every holiday, when he barely concealed his contempt at their modest spread, or when he mocked Grandpa's old truck parked next to his luxury sedan. I didn't know it then, but that resentment was festering, waiting for the day when my grandparents' choices would ignite a family war. At the time, though, I was blissfully unaware of just how much their philosophy would come to matter. To me, my grandparents were simply my safe haven, the people who made me feel seen and loved. I didn't realize that their decision to live by their principles rather than bend to entitlement would one day place me squarely in the middle of the storm they had long feared might come. It was a Tuesday night when my world broke apart. I had just finished prepping lesson plans for the next day, sitting cross-legged on the carpet of my little apartment with construction paper and glue sticks spread around me, when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something in me knew before I even picked up that nothing good could come from a call at 8:47 p.m. "Is this Emily Carter?" the voice asked. It was steady, official, but softened with a kind of practiced compassion. "Yes," I whispered, already bracing myself. "This is Officer Daniels with the Columbus Police Department. I'm afraid I have some very difficult news." I stopped breathing. My heart hammered against my ribs, desperate to run, desperate to escape what I already sensed was about to come crashing down. "Your grandparents, Helen and Robert Carter, were in a car accident tonight. A drunk driver ran a red light and struck their vehicle. I'm so sorry, Miss Carter, but they didn't survive. It was instantaneous. They didn't suffer." I dropped the phone. Literally dropped it onto the floor as though the words had burned my skin. For a moment, all I heard was a high-pitched ringing in my ears, like the sound after a firework explodes too close. My chest tightened, my stomach clenched, and suddenly, I was doubled over on the carpet, the bright construction paper blurring through my tears. The glue stick rolled under the couch, and all I could think in my haze was how ridiculous it was that life could shatter while something so trivial kept rolling forward. I don't remember much of that night except the emptiness. I tried calling their house over and over even though I knew they wouldn't answer. Their voicemail message, Grandma's warm voice saying, "You've reached the Carters, leave us a note," felt like knives. I must have played it a dozen times, sobbing harder with each replay until my throat ached and my chest physically hurt. The days leading up to the funeral blurred together. I barely slept, barely ate. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grandpa's smile when he teased me about overwatering his tomatoes or Grandma's hands guiding mine as we braided bread dough. Gone. Both gone in an instant because some stranger decided their night of drinking was more important than someone else's life. The morning of the funeral, I forced myself into the black dress I'd worn for my college graduation, a dress my grandparents had proudly bought me. I pinned my hair back the way Grandma always liked and drove to the church with my hands trembling on the wheel. The closer I got, the heavier the grief pressed against me, as if the air itself didn't want me to keep moving. When I arrived, I was greeted not by warmth, not by comfort, but by the staged performance of grief my family had perfected over the years. My father, Charles, stood at the entrance shaking hands with guests like it was a business networking event. His designer suit was immaculate, his expression solemn but practiced, as if he'd rehearsed it in the mirror. My mother, Diane, hovered nearby, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, careful not to smudge her makeup. I knew the truth, they hadn't set foot in my grandparents' home in years, except when they wanted money. Yet here they were, front and center, acting like they had lost their entire world. My younger brother, Adam, had flown in from California. He leaned against a pew scrolling on his phone, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses while guests whispered condolences he barely acknowledged. Aunt Linda sat near the front, dabbing her eyes theatrically and sighing loud enough for everyone to notice. Her husband, Uncle Mark, stood behind her like a shadow, nodding gravely but saying little, as though the mere tilt of his head was enough to prove his sorrow. The hypocrisy of it all stung more than I expected. These people, who had ignored my grandparents' invitations, who had dismissed their values, who had rolled their eyes when I chose to spend weekends in their cozy kitchen instead of at some social function, were now dressed in black and playing the role of devoted family. I sat quietly in the second row. hands clenched in my lap, feeling utterly alienated. Not because I didn't love my grandparents enough, but because I loved them too much, because my grief was real, while theirs was performative. My tears fell hot and unrelenting, blurring the stained glass windows above the altar. The service was beautiful, though. The pastor spoke of Helen and Robert's generosity, their commitment to community, their unshakable faith. Stories poured in from neighbors, employees, and friends. How they had donated quietly to rebuild the local library. How they had paid a struggling employee's mortgage without ever expecting repayment. How they had organized food drives long before it was trendy. Listening to those stories, I realized their legacy extended far beyond the walls of our family. Their lives had touched hundreds, maybe thousands, in ways I was only beginning to understand. Still, as much as those stories comforted me, they also deepened the ache. Because they were gone. Because I would never again walk into their kitchen and see Grandma's lemon bars cooling on the counter, or hear Grandpa's off-key humming drifting from the garden. At the reception afterward, my parents slipped easily back into their usual roles. My father argued with the funeral director over costs, insisting the casket price was inflated, while my mother floated between groups of women, ensuring she was seen grieving gracefully. Adam was in the corner, FaceTiming a friend about an upcoming trip, while Aunt Linda dabbed her eyes dramatically for the benefit of a photographer who had shown up to capture community leaders paying respects. Meanwhile, I stood by the dessert table, holding a paper plate I couldn't bring myself to fill. The voices around me blurred into background noise. I felt like I was floating outside of my own body, watching everyone move through their motions while I drowned silently in my grief. It was in that moment, surrounded by family yet lonelier than I'd ever felt, that my grandparents' words echoed in my mind. Money is just a tool, Emily. Your worth is in your choices, and I realized then that this emptiness, this performance of grief was exactly what they had meant when they warned me about people confusing money with meaning. My parents saw life as transactions, appearances, investments. My grandparents had seen life as connections, integrity, and choices. And even in my devastation, I clung to that difference like a lifeline. That night, back in my apartment, I pulled Grandma's quilt over my shoulders and sat in the dark, replaying their lessons in my head. They had taught me how to stand firm, how to find joy in small things, how to believe that values mattered more than wealth. If I let my grief consume me, if I let my family's hollow performances distort the memory of who my grandparents truly were, then I would be betraying them. So I whispered into the darkness, voice breaking but steady in its promise. I'll remember, Grandma. I'll remember, Grandpa. I'll live the way you taught me to, no matter what happens next. I didn't know then just how much that vow would be tested in the weeks to come. 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a call that would change everything. The number on my phone displayed Anderson and White, attorneys at law. My stomach dropped before I even answered. I knew what this was about: the will. Miss Carter. A steady, professional voice said. This is Michael Anderson. Your grandparents appointed me as executor of their estate. I'd like you, along with your immediate family, to attend the reading of the will this Friday morning at 10 o'clock. The words felt heavy, final. Until that moment, my grief had been a fog I could wander inside. But hearing executor of the estate snapped me into the harsh reality that everything Helen and Robert had built, everything they left behind, was now officially up for discussion. And in our family, discussion almost always meant conflict. That Friday dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and mirrors your mood. I arrived 15 minutes early. Clutching the umbrella my grandmother had once insisted I keep in my car, just in case. Anderson's office was housed in a restored Victorian home downtown. Inside, polished wood paneling, antique rugs, and the faint smell of leather made it feel less like a law firm and more like someone's living room. Michael Anderson himself greeted me in the foyer. He was in his 60s, tall, with thinning silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. My grandparents had spoken of him often, not just as their lawyer, but as a trusted friend. Emily, he said softly, shaking my hand. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandparents were extraordinary people. I'll miss Robert's chess lessons and Helen's lemon squares at our meetings. The sincerity in his voice nearly undid me. Thank you, I whispered, blinking back tears. They always said you were more like family than a lawyer. Have. Before I could gather myself, the glass door swung open and the rest of my family swept in all at once, like a gust of wind that shifted the entire atmosphere. My father, Charles, entered first, adjusting the cufflinks on his perfectly pressed suit and checking his Rolex with an impatient flick of his wrist. At 56, he looked like a sharper, colder version of my grandfather, without any of the warmth. My mother, Diane, trailed behind, her designer handbag practically screaming its price tag, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood. Adam followed, sunglasses perched on his head despite the rain, a wrinkled shirt half tucked into his jeans. He slouched into a chair without so much as a glance at me. Behind him came Aunt Linda, already talking loudly on her phone about some club drama, and Uncle Mark, silent as always, trailing after her like a shadow. Well, my father announced, glancing around the foyer. Let's get this over with. Some of us have real businesses to run. Michael Anderson's polite smile didn't falter. Of course, Charles. Right this way. We filed into a large conference room, its centerpiece a long oak table polished to a gleam. My father immediately took the seat at one end, as if staking his claim before the will was even read. My mother settled beside him, Adam slouched next to her, and Aunt Linda perched dramatically across from them. I chose a seat near Michael, close enough to feel anchored, far enough from my father's glare to breathe. Before we begin, Michael said once we were settled. I want to be clear. Helen and Robert Carter were of sound mind when they updated their will last year. They underwent cognitive evaluations by 2 independent doctors and left explicit written and recorded statements regarding their wishes. My father waved a dismissive hand. Yes, Michael. Spare us the legal jargon. We all know how this goes. Dad built the business. I'm his son. Standard inheritance procedure. Just read it. Michael opened a leather portfolio, adjusted his glasses, and began. The first few minutes were dry legal language revoking prior wills, confirming executors, but my pulse quickened as I waited for the part that mattered. My family shifted impatiently, sighing and tapping fingers. Finally, Michael reached the heart of the matter. We hereby bequeath our entire estate, including but not limited to all cash assets totaling approximately $8 million. Our investment portfolio valued at approximately $12 million. All real estate holdings, including our primary residence, valued at approximately $3 million. And our 40% ownership stake in Carter Supply and Company, valued at approximately $1 million, to our beloved granddaughter, Emily Grace Carter. The room went silent, the kind of silence that vibrates in your chest. I stopped breathing. Surely I had misheard. Michael continued. Voice steady. We specifically and intentionally make no provisions for our son, Charles Carter, our daughter-in-law, Diane Carter, our grandson, Adam Carter, our daughter, Linda Davis, or our son-in-law, Mark Davis, as we have provided for them amply during our lifetime and have made our reasons clear to our attorney. For a long beat, no one moved. Then my father shot out of his chair so fast it tipped backward. This is ridiculous, he shouted, snatching the document from Michael's hands. He scanned it, his face reddening by the second. They've been manipulated. This is fraud. My mother's voice dripped with venom. $24 million? To a preschool teacher? She wouldn't know the first thing about managing that kind of money. This is absurd. Adam slammed his hand on the table. What about me? I'm family too. I need capital for my startup. Aunt Linda's cheeks flushed crimson as she turned on me. What did you do, Emily? How did you trick them into this? What kind of games did you play with them? I sat frozen, words caught in my throat. $24 million. My humble, coupon-clipping grandparents had left behind that much? And they gave it all to me? My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. Michael calmly retrieved the will from my father's grip. If you will all, please sit, there is more. He pressed a button on a remote, and a flat screen on the wall flickered to life. My breath caught as the image of my grandparents appeared. They sat side by side on their familiar sofa, my grandmother's hand resting lightly on my grandfather's knee. Seeing them alive again, even through a recording, made my eyes blur with tears. If you're watching this, Grandpa began, his voice deep and steady. It means we've passed on. We want to explain our decisions directly, to prevent any misunderstandings. Grandma leaned forward, eyes kind but firm. Charles, Linda, we love you as our children. But we have been deeply disappointed by the values you've embraced and passed on. For decades, we watched you prioritize material wealth over relationships. You treated us as resources to tap, not parents to cherish. My father's jaw clenched. Aunt Linda muttered under her breath, but the video continued. The business we built, Grandpa said, was never about amassing wealth. It was about creating stability for our family and opportunities for our employees. We built it through hard work, integrity, and fairness. Emily is the only one who has consistently demonstrated those values. Grandma smiled faintly, tears brimming in her eyes. She visited not because she wanted something, but because she cared. She chose a career helping children, not because it paid well, but because it fulfilled her. We trust Emily to honor our legacy, to use these resources wisely, not squander them on status symbols or schemes. The video continued with them outlining their hopes for how the money might support education, community programs, and the employees who had stood by them for decades. By the time the screen went dark, I was openly crying, clutching a tissue Michael had silently handed me. This is absolute garbage, my father exploded. They were clearly senile. We'll contest this, no judge will uphold it. Michael's expression didn't waver. They anticipated that response. Their competence is extensively documented. Contesting this will be extremely difficult, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful. My mother's voice softened into sickly sweetness. Darling Emily, you know this isn't right. Your grandparents were confused. This money belongs to the family. You'll share it, won't you? I felt cornered, every pair of eyes on me. My mouth opened, then closed. I need time. I stammered. There's nothing to think about. Adam scoffed. That money should be divided equally or at least managed by someone with business experience. He smirked at my father. Meaning me. My father added quickly. Their voices rose, overlapping accusations, demands, and threats. Aunt Linda's eyes bored into me with fury. Snake. You poisoned them against us. NDX. Through it all, Michael rested a steady hand on my arm. You don't have to decide anything today, Emily, he said gently. Take your time, my office will handle all immediate matters. Here. He slid an envelope toward me. This contains the documents, keys to their house, and contact information for their advisors. Call me with any questions. As the argument crescendoed, Michael finally raised his voice. Enough. This meeting is concluded. We all stood. My father grabbed my arm, leaning close enough that I felt his breath on my cheek. This isn't over, he hissed. Come to our house tonight at 6. We'll sort this out as a family. His tone made clear this wasn't a request. Shaken, I nodded, too overwhelmed to resist. They left in their separate luxury cars, faces set with anger and calculation. I sat in my 10-year-old sedan in the rain-slick parking lot, envelope clutched in my hands, my entire body trembling. What was supposed to be a blessing felt like a curse. My grandparents had trusted me with everything. And now, I was about to find out just how ugly my family could become when money was on the line. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway that evening, my stomach was in knots. The rain from earlier had given way to a damp chill, and their sprawling brick and glass house looked even more imposing under the floodlights that illuminated the manicured hedges and stone walkway. My father's luxury sedan and my mother's gleaming white SUV were already parked out front, along with Adam's flashy sports car paid for, I knew, by them. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring at the glowing windows, feeling less like a daughter coming home and more like a lamb walking into a wolf's den. I clutched the thick envelope Michael Anderson had given me earlier, the weight of it heavy in my lap. Inside were the legal documents, keys, and all the proof of what my grandparents had entrusted to me. But instead of feeling secure, I felt like I was holding a target. When I stepped inside, the atmosphere was already charged. My father stood by the fireplace, glass of scotch in hand, projecting authority as if he were the head of a board meeting rather than a grieving son. My mother perched on the edge of an ornate chair, posture perfect, her face a mask of forced calm. Adam sprawled across the sofa, legs up, scrolling on his phone, barely acknowledging me. Aunt Linda paced the room, gesturing dramatically as she whispered into her cell, while Uncle Mark hovered near the window, silent and withdrawn. Sit down, Emily. My father ordered, not bothering with a greeting. His tone was clipped, Rehearsed the same one he used in negotiations when he wanted to remind everyone he was in control. I lowered myself into a chair near the door, acutely aware that I might need a quick exit. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and polished wood, but beneath it was something sour, something hostile. My father began without preamble. Let's be reasonable about this. Your grandparents weren't thinking clearly. They meant for the family to benefit, not just you. So here's what's going to happen. You sign over control of the estate to me. I'll manage everything properly. You'll receive a generous portion, say, 10%. That's more than enough for someone with your modest needs. 10%? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. My heart pounded in my ears. That's over $2 million, my father pressed. More money than you'd ever see otherwise. Be grateful. Adam leaned forward, finally putting down his phone. Yeah, sis. $2 million is plenty for a preschool teacher. I need at least 5 for my new business idea, crypto trading platforms. It's going to be huge. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Adam had burned through thousands before on failed ventures, from an app rating public restrooms to a food delivery service that collapsed in 6 months. And yet here he was, demanding millions with the same entitlement as always. My mother clasped her hands together and tilted her head, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Darling, we're only thinking of you. Managing wealth is complicated. Your father has the experience. The knowledge. You'll still be comfortable. Isn't that what matters? Something inside me hardened. I looked at each of them, their expectant faces, their smug assurance that I would fold under pressure, and for the first time, I felt a spark of defiance. No, I said quietly. The word seemed to suck the air out of the room. My father's eyes narrowed. What did you just say? I said no, I'm not signing. Grandma and Grandpa trusted me with their legacy for a reason. I intend to honor that. Aunt Linda gasped theatrically. Ungrateful. After everything this family has done for you, you spit in our faces? After everything you've done for me? The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. When was the last time any of you showed up for me? Or for them? You didn't visit. You didn't care. You just want the money. My mother's face twisted, her voice rising in a shrill crescendo. We gave you life, Emily. We gave you a home, opportunities, private school, braces, dance lessons. And this is how you repay us? By taking everything and leaving us with nothing? You didn't give me love. I shot back. My voice shook, but I didn't look away. You gave me obligations. Grandma and Grandpa gave me everything that mattered. My father slammed his glass down on the mantel so hard it cracked. Enough. You have a choice to make right now. Either you sign that paper and remain part of this family, or you walk out that door and consider yourself disowned. You can't have both. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. My pulse raced. I looked from face to face, searching for even a flicker of compassion, of love. But there was nothing, just greed, anger, and calculation. I won't sign, I said finally, steadying my voice. I'm sorry you feel this way, but I won't betray what Grandma and Grandpa wanted. For a moment, no one moved. Then my father let out a cold, humorless laugh. You live in that little apartment, don't you? The one we co-signed because your salary wasn't enough to qualify? Check your lease, Emily. We own that building through one of our companies. Consider your lease terminated. You have 30 minutes to pack your things. The locks will be changed tomorrow. My stomach dropped. The room tilted. They weren't just threatening, they were actually making me homeless over money they hadn't earned. My mother glanced at her watch, her tone brisk. Better hurry, sweetheart. The clock is ticking. Adam smirked. Hope those millions keep you warm tonight. I stood on shaky legs, my mind reeling. In less than an hour, I had gone from stunned beneficiary to estranged daughter being cast out of her family's home. My father followed me upstairs like a guard, arms crossed, ensuring I only took essentials. My hands trembled as I stuffed clothes, toiletries, and documents into 2 duffel bags. I grabbed my grandmother's quilt from the bed, the one thing I couldn't bear to leave behind. You were never really part of this family anyway, my father said coldly as I zipped the bag. Your mother and I almost divorced before you were born. You were the obligation that kept us together. We've wasted enough time and money on you. The cruelty of his words sliced deeper than any eviction notice. My mother appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. Everything we spent on you, school, braces, camps, was an investment. And you've proven you were a bad one. I refused to let them see me cry. With 3 bags over my shoulder, I walked down the grand staircase, each step echoing like a drumbeat. At the door, I turned back one last time. They stood in a row, my father, my mother, Adam, Aunt Linda, Uncle Mark, all wearing variations of anger, disdain, and smugness. You may have money now, my mother said icily. But family is forever. And you'll regret choosing money over us. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. I'm not the one throwing away family, I whispered. You are. Then I stepped out into the cold night air. The door slammed behind me, the sound final and absolute. I loaded my bags into the back seat of my old car, slid behind the wheel, and for the first time that day, I let myself break. Great heaving sobs racked my body as I gripped the steering wheel. Tears blurring the driveway, until the house became a smear of lights and shadow. In the span of a few hours, I had gained millions but lost the only family I had left. And yet, even in that devastation, one thing was clear: I would not give in. I would not betray Helen and Robert's trust. Heartbroken but determined, I started the engine and drove away from the house that had never felt like home. The night I left my parents' house, I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets of Columbus, my bags piled in the back seat, my grandmother's quilt covering them like a fragile shield. I had nowhere to go. My apartment was gone, the locks would be changed by morning. My parents had seen to that. For a brief, desperate moment, I considered checking into a motel, but my credit card wouldn't survive more than a night or two. And then I remembered the envelope Michael Anderson had given me. Inside were not just documents and contact lists but also a familiar set of keys. Attached was my grandmother's little rabbit-shaped keychain, worn from years of use. The sight of it brought fresh tears to my eyes. These weren't just keys, they were hers. They were mine now, and they were the key to something far greater, my grandparents' house. It felt both terrifying and inevitable when I pulled into their driveway 20 minutes later. The porch light was on, probably set on the timer Grandpa had installed ages ago. I sat in my car for several minutes, staring at the dark silhouette of the home I had loved so dearly. For weeks I had avoided it, unable to face the emptiness inside. Now it was the only place left for me. When I finally opened the door with shaking hands, I was hit with a wave of familiarity so strong it nearly buckled my knees. The air still carried the faint scent of lemon verbena potpourri and wood polish. The furniture sat exactly as they had left it. On the entryway table, a bowl still held a few peppermints Grandpa had kept for visitors. It felt as though they might walk in at any moment. I dropped my bags in the guest room, my room, the one I had always stayed in on weekends. The quilt was still folded neatly at the end of the bed. On the nightstand sat the novel I had been reading the last time I was here, a bookmark still tucked halfway through. Tears blurred my vision. They had left everything ready for me, as if they knew I would need this sanctuary. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, pulling me out of a restless sleep. I was still in yesterday's clothes, my head pounding from crying. My phone buzzed with missed calls and angry messages from my parents and Adam, alternating between threats and false promises. We can still fix this if you're reasonable. You have 24 hours before we file suit. Enjoy that house while you can, it won't be yours for long. I forwarded one particularly aggressive text from Adam to Michael. His response came within minutes. Stay at the house. Don't answer the door for anyone but me. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Exactly half an hour later, his car pulled into the driveway. He stepped out with his briefcase in one hand and a cardboard carrier of coffee in the other. First things first, he said once inside, sliding a steaming cup toward me at the breakfast nook. Your family has already contacted several attorneys about contesting the will. I anticipated this. Your grandparents did too. They prepared extensively. I clutched the warm cup like a lifeline. They kicked me out last night. Dad owns my apartment building through one of his companies. Michael nodded grimly, as though he'd expected this. Typical Charles. He always uses leverage. But what he didn't count on is that Helen and Robert accounted for his tactics years ago. They made sure you'd never be left without options. Before I could respond, a knock sounded at the back door. I froze, but Michael smiled reassuringly. That will be Carlos. Carlos? Carlos Rivera. I explained. Your grandparents' caretaker for nearly 15 years. He lives in the guest house out back. They asked him to keep an eye on things, especially after the funeral. I opened the door to find a man in his early 50s, strong but kind-faced, with salt and pepper hair. He held his cap in his hands respectfully. "Miss Emily," he said warmly. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandparents were wonderful people. I saw your car this morning and wanted to check if you needed anything." And the simple kindness undid me. My voice cracked as I whispered, "Thank you. I'm a little overwhelmed." He nodded knowingly. "Mr. Robert and Mrs. Helen worried about this. They asked me to look after you if anything ever happened to them. The house, the grounds, everything is maintained. And..." He glanced at Michael. "I have something you should see." We sat at the kitchen table as Carlos set down a small USB drive. "After the funeral," he said carefully, "your father and brother came here when no one was around. They took things: jewelry, watches, electronics. I have it all on the security cameras." My heart sank, but Michael's eyes lit with grim satisfaction. "This could be very useful." Carlos nodded. "What they don't know is that last year, Mr. Robert asked me to update the entire system. He didn't trust the one Charles installed years ago, too many blind spots. I replaced everything, added cloud backups. Everything is recorded." I felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly choked me. Even from beyond the grave, my grandparents had protected me. Later that afternoon, another familiar face appeared at the door. Dorothy Williams, my grandparents' housekeeper of 20 years, stepped inside carrying a basket of muffins. She hugged me tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. "You look so much like Helen did when she was your age," she said. "She was so proud of you." Over coffee, Dorothy revealed something else. "Your grandmother kept journals. She wrote everything down: visits, conversations, every time someone asked for money. She wanted there to be a record, in case this day ever came." She led me to the study, where shelves of leather-bound journals lined the wall. Each was dated meticulously. I pulled one down and opened to an entry written in my grandmother's elegant handwriting. "May 15. Charles visited today the first time in 7 months. He didn't ask about our health. Immediately launched into a pitch about a cryptocurrency investment, needing $250,000. When Robert refused, Charles grew hostile, accused us of favoring Emily, said she only visits to secure her inheritance. Couldn't be more wrong. Emily has never asked for money, has no idea of our net worth. She brings food every Sunday, stays to eat with us." Charles left without finishing his coffee. Robert upset the rest of the day. I flipped through page after page of similar entries. Adam pitching absurd business schemes, my mother making snide comments about their modest lifestyle, Aunt Linda dropping hints about expensive emergencies. In contrast, my visits were described with affection, bringing homemade soup, helping them set up video chat, reading to Grandma when her eyes grew tired. Tears blurred my vision again. They had seen me. They had always seen me. As if that weren't enough, Renee Jacobs arrived the next day. She was my grandparents' longtime business partner at Carter's Supply and Company. A sharp but warm woman in her 50s who exuded quiet authority. "Emily," she said, taking my hand. "Your grandparents prepared me for this. They knew Charles would come after everything. I'm here to guide you through the business. You don't have to take on an active role, but I'll teach you enough to make informed decisions. Their employees respect you, and they trust that you'll protect what your grandparents built." Over the next few days, I found myself surrounded by a circle of allies my grandparents had quietly assembled on my behalf. Carlos maintained the grounds and watched over the house. Dorothy provided not only her presence but also invaluable written records. Renee explained company ledgers in ways I could understand, patient with my questions. And Michael orchestrated the legal defense, ensuring that every angle my parents might pursue had already been anticipated. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel alone. One evening, sitting in the study surrounded by journals and documents, I realized just how far ahead my grandparents had planned. They knew exactly who my father and brother were. They knew greed would drive them to try and take everything. And so, piece by piece, they had left me not only their fortune but also the tools and people I would need to defend it. I leaned back in the leather chair, one of Grandpa's favorites, and whispered into the quiet room. "You knew this was coming, didn't you? You were protecting me even from this." The house seemed to sigh in response, as though it were alive with their presence. And in that moment, though my heart was still heavy with grief, I felt something else rising within me. Resolve. My family thought they could isolate me, bully me, strip me of everything until I surrendered. But what they didn't know was that Helen and Robert Carter had already prepared me for this fight. They had armed me not with wealth alone, but with truth, allies, and evidence. And I intended to use it. The morning of the confrontation began with a knot in my stomach so tight I thought I might be sick. I had barely slept the night before, pacing the upstairs hallway of my grandparents' house, rereading journal entries and replaying their video message in my mind. Every page I turned, every sentence I underlined reminded me of the same truth. They had trusted me. Not Charles, not Diane, not Adam, not Linda or Mark. Me. And today would be the day I either stood firm or watched their legacy crumble under the weight of greed. By 9 o'clock, the house was filled with allies. Michael Anderson had arrived first, briefcase in hand, calm as ever. Renee Jacobs followed soon after, carrying her laptop and company records neatly organized in binders. Dorothy bustled about the kitchen, brewing coffee and laying out breakfast as if preparing for a Sunday family gathering, her presence grounding me with the warmth of familiarity. Carlos took his usual place near the front door, his broad frame and quiet resolve radiating a silent warning to anyone who might try to cross the threshold uninvited. And then, right at 9:30, the last piece of the puzzle walked through the door. Judge Harold Whitaker, a retired family court judge who had been one of my grandparents' dearest friends. He was tall, dignified, with a voice that carried quiet authority. He shook my hand firmly. "Your grandparents asked me to be here in case this day ever came," he said. "They suspected your father would not go quietly. But don't be afraid, Emily. Truth has a way of speaking louder than anger." His words steadied me more than he could have known. At exactly 10, the sound of tires on gravel echoed up the long driveway. I watched from the living room window as a line of vehicles pulled in. My father's sleek black sedan, my mother's white SUV, Adam's flashy sports car, and finally Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark's fire-red convertible. They parked in formation, like soldiers ready for battle. I could already feel the energy radiating from them, anger, entitlement, greed. The pounding on the front door came seconds later, rattling the frame. "Emily," my father's voice thundered. "Open this door. We're here to collect what rightfully belongs to us." I glanced at Carlos, who gave me a reassuring nod before opening the door. My father stormed inside, my mother at his heels, her lips pursed in disapproval. Adam swaggered in behind them, his sunglasses perched arrogantly on his head. Aunt Linda entered loudly, already muttering accusations under her breath, and Uncle Mark trailed after, avoiding eye contact. They all froze when they saw who was waiting in the living room. I stood in the center, my grandparents' journals spread neatly on the coffee table before me. To my right, Michael adjusted his glasses, his briefcase open and ready. Renee sat poised with her binders, her laptop glowing faintly. Dorothy stood behind me, hands clasped, calm but resolute. Carlos leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. And at the far end of the room, Judge Whitaker sat in Grandpa's old recliner, his presence a reminder that this was not just family business anymore, this was accountability. "What is this?" my mother hissed, scanning the room. "You brought outsiders into our private matters?" "This isn't a private matter," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "It's about honoring Grandma and Grandpa's wishes. And today, you're going to hear the truth." My father barked a bitter laugh. "The truth? The truth is you manipulated two old people into cutting out their own family. But that ends now. You'll sign the estate over to me, or we'll take you to court." Michael spoke up then, his tone crisp. "Actually, Charles, before you start making demands, perhaps you should review this." He slid a thick folder across the table toward my father. Inside were cease and desist letters prepared for each family member, ready to be filed if the harassment continued. Any further threats or attempts to coerce Emily will result in immediate legal action. Adam rolled his eyes. "Oh please. None of this means anything. We all know this was supposed to be ours. Emily doesn't know the first thing about managing millions. She should just step aside." Renee leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. Emily doesn't need to step aside. She has support, advisors, and the respect of everyone at Carter Supply. Unlike you, Adam, she hasn't tried to drain the company's accounts for harebrained schemes. I have records of every request you and Charles made over the years. Would you like me to read them aloud? She opened a binder and began. In 2016, Charles attempted an unauthorized transfer of funds from the company's retirement account. In 2018, Adam requested $150,000 for a restaurant app that collapsed within 6 months. In 2020, Charles attempted to pressure Helen into selling company assets at below market value to cover personal debts. All refused. All documented. Adam's face flushed, his bravado faltering. That's taken out of context. Is it? Renee shot back, sliding copies of emails across the table with his name on them. Aunt Linda clutched her pearls, glaring at me. You poisonous little snake. You turned them against us. They were old and confused. You filled their heads with lies. Endfrin. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, his deep voice silencing the room. I have reviewed Helen's journals, Mrs. Davis. There is no evidence of manipulation. On the contrary, there is overwhelming evidence of your repeated neglect and financial demands. Your parents were clear and deliberate in their reasoning. My father's composure began to crack. His face darkened, his jaw clenched. This is nonsense. They were senile. No court will uphold this. Michael raised a hand. You might want to reconsider that statement, Charles. In addition to the medical evaluations confirming Helen and Robert's mental capacity, we also have video evidence. Carlos stepped forward, holding up a USB drive. After the funeral, you and Adam came here and stole jewelry, watches, electronics. It's all on camera. Updated security system. Cloud backups. I watched as my father's face went pale, the arrogance draining from him in an instant. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Adam muttered something under his breath, but his voice shook. Dorothy stepped forward then, her voice steady. I was here too. I saw how they treated Helen and Robert. I saw the disrespect, the endless requests for money, the way they made them feel small for choosing to live simply. And I wrote it all down. She held up one of the journals. Every detail. Every visit. Every insult. The weight of the evidence filled the room like an avalanche. My family shifted uncomfortably, the fight draining out of them as reality settled in. I stepped forward, my voice firm and unyielding. I won't give up what they trusted me with. This isn't about money, it's about honoring their legacy. They built everything with integrity, with kindness, with sacrifice. And I will protect that. No amount of threats or manipulation will change it. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavier than the shouting had been. My father finally slammed his hand on the table, though the gesture felt hollow. This isn't over, he muttered. But even he knew the fight was lost. One by one, they retreated. My mother swept past me, her face tight with rage. Adam shoved his hands into his pockets, muttering curses as he followed. Aunt Linda hissed something about betrayal. And Uncle Mark trailed silently behind her, his eyes avoiding mine. My father was the last to leave, his glare searing into me, but there was no triumph in it, only defeat. The sound of their cars disappearing down the driveway left the house quieter than it had been in weeks. For the first time since the will reading, I felt the tension ease from my shoulders. Dorothy exhaled deeply. Carlos gave me a small, proud nod. Renee squeezed my hand. You did it, Michael said quietly. You stood your ground. I can't. I looked around the room at the journals, the evidence, the people who had come together to support me, and felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. I hadn't just defended an inheritance. I had defended Helen and Robert's memory, their values, their love. And though my family had left humiliated, I knew they'd never truly understand what they had lost. Because the inheritance was never just about the money, it was about something much greater. It was about legacy. The months that followed were a blur of adjustment, learning, and quiet rebuilding. For weeks after the confrontation, I woke every morning half expecting another fight, another demand, another ambush at my door. But it never came. My family's humiliation that day had silenced them more effectively than I could have imagined. They tried, of course, angry texts from Adam when yet another one of his ventures collapsed. A few carefully worded emails from my mother suggesting we heal as a family by allowing her to serve on the board of my new little foundation. And a phone call from my father when his own company ran into cash flow issues. But their motives were always transparent, tied directly to money or influence. And each time, I held the line. I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Setting boundaries wasn't cruel, it was necessary. With Michael's guidance and Renee's mentorship, I began the work my grandparents had hoped for. We officially established the Helen and Robert Carter Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to education and community development. $10 million was allocated to scholarships for underprivileged students across Ohio, with special emphasis on vocational training and arts programs, two areas my grandparents had always believed in. The first time I handed a scholarship certificate to a high school senior whose parents worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. I felt my grandparents' presence so strongly, I could almost hear Grandma whisper, "This is why." End quote. I surprised many people, maybe even myself, by continuing to teach. My classroom of 4-year-olds, at Little Sprouts Academy, remained my sanctuary. With my new resources, I quietly funded healthy snacks, new books, and playground equipment. To the kids, I was still just Miss Carter, the teacher who tied their shoelaces and read stories with silly voices. That was exactly how I wanted it. Wealth didn't change who I was, it simply gave me the chance to expand the good I could do. The house, once so painfully empty, slowly filled with life again. Dorothy insisted on coming by 3 days a week, though I paid her a full salary and begged her to take time off. "Your grandmother would haunt me if I retired completely," she said with a wink, setting down trays of her famous muffins. Carlos tended the grounds with the same care as ever, often leaving fresh vegetables from the garden at my kitchen door. Renee became more than a mentor, she became a friend, inviting me to family dinners and reminding me that support didn't have to come from blood relatives. One Sunday evening, surrounded by this chosen family, Michael at the head of the table telling lawyer jokes, Dorothy scolding Carlos for tracking in dirt, Renee laughing with her husband, I realized something. I wasn't alone. I had lost the family I was born into, but I had gained the family I was meant to have. As autumn leaves swirled outside the windows, I sat in the study one night, journals open before me, and whispered the words I wished my grandparents could hear. Money revealed my family's true colors, but it also revealed your true legacy, love, respect, and the power to create good. I'll carry that forward. Always. And for the first time since that awful night of the phone call, I felt at peace. When I look back on everything that happened, the greatest lesson I carry isn't about wealth, it's about worth. My grandparents always told me, money is just a tool. Your true value lies in your choices. At first, I didn't fully understand what they meant. But when I inherited their estate, I saw how quickly money stripped away the masks people wear. My parents, my brother, even extended relatives showed me that greed can poison love, and entitlement can destroy trust. It hurt deeply to realize the family I longed for cared more about control than connection. But it also freed me to recognize that blood alone doesn't define family. Family is built on respect, kindness, and support, even when nothing material is on the table. I learned that setting boundaries doesn't mean you're cruel, it means you honor yourself and those who genuinely value you. Today, I choose to live simply, to use what I've been given to lift others, and to surround myself with people who remind me of the love my grandparents instilled in me. In the end, legacy isn't about money left behind, it's about values carried forward. That is the true inheritance. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.